Triumvirate Holdings is an organization of 3 evil Roman emperors, who are Commodus, Caligula, and Nero. This group served as the main antagonist in the Trials of Apollo series, but they had been secretly working behind the scenes this entire time. In this video, I'll be talking about Triumvirate Holdings, the company that helped start 2 great wars, and what I like to call the overlooked villains of the Riordanverse. Before jumping into it, there will obviously be spoilers for PJO, Heroes of Olympus, and the Trials of Apollo. And with that, let's get started. Triumvirate Holdings' origin is pretty tricky to place in the Riordanverse timeline, but we do know that it starts way before the events of PJO, or the first series. To fully understand this organization, we'll have to go through each member of the Triumvirate. Let's start with Commodus. Commodus, in both Roman history and Percy Jackson lore, was an emperor of Rome and the son of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina. He had a brother who died very young, and his father was the one who educated him. From that point, Commodus was described as an arrogant and privileged kid who excelled in arts. Fast forwarding a couple of events, we head to the Percy Jackson version of Commodus' life. Around the age of 18, Commodus finally became emperor, and at the same time, he was actually dating the god of prophecies, Apollo. In Apollo's perspectives in the Dark Prophecy, it's clear he loved Commodus, but this sadly didn't last. Commodus' reign as emperor fell into corruption, and the Roman Senate wanted him gone. However, Apollo was the one who stopped Commodus once and for all. As a god, Apollo was able to shapeshift into another person, and he disguised himself as Narcissus, a mortal man who was also Commodus' personal trainer. Apollo didn't want to push through with the plan, but he knew he had no choice. With this, Apollo, or Narcissus, lured Commodus to a bath, and Apollo strangled Commodus to death. Commodus was strong enough to thrash and try to escape, but using his godly powers, Apollo managed to keep him in place. Before dying, Commodus seemed to realize that Narcissus was Apollo, and his last words were, "You blessed me." This is because earlier in the book, Apollo gave him his blessing to comfort Commodus when Commodus' father died, so these last words really hurt Apollo. Apollo starts crying as Commodus dies in his arms. This seemed to be the end of Commodus' story, but little did Apollo know that it was just getting started. Despite being controversial, Commodus actually formed a pretty good following of people, and they started to worship him. In the Riordanverse, any form of worship towards someone propels them to become a god, and this happened to Commodus. He was reincarnated as a minor god, and he joined his fellow Triumvirate members, Nero and Caligula. Now, let's talk about the next member, Caligula. To put it simple, Caligula is the more unhinged version of Commodus. To be honest, I think Commodus was crazy enough in his reign. Like, I didn't mention it anymore because Rick also tried to brush past it, but if you search actual history online, Commodus is also considered pretty insane, but Caligula was a different breed of crazy, so let's get into it. Caligula was born to a woman named Agrippina, and he was the grandson of the first emperor of Rome, or Augustus. His birth name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but he was called Caligula, which meant small boots, because he would often join the military with his father in this little guard uniform. So yeah, it became a joke in the army back in the day. So a couple of events after his father's death, Caligula became the emperor of Rome. Caligula started as a pretty sane and cool emperor. He was actually loved by the public because of his Roman games and other public activities, but this did not last long. The fame and wealth he had as an emperor slowly got to his head, and he became a tyrant. Like Commodus, Caligula fell into insanity, and he became a corrupt politician. He made ridiculous requests that were so brutal that even the gods of Olympus were concerned. They actually disguised themselves in a party once to check out how crazy Caligula was, and they were appalled. In the Burning Maze, we see this moment through Apollo's dream, and Apollo witnesses Caligula pull out a guy's tongue and turn it into silver for everyone to see. This because the guy was a poet with a silver tongue, and Caligula did this just to make a point. This moment was so unsettling, especially when I first read it, and Apollo even feels the same way in this chapter, admitting that it takes a lot to make a god nervous, but Caligula managed to make him feel that way. Caligula's reign as emperor continued for years, until he was assassinated by his guards. However, like Commodus, he managed to get a good following of people despite the controversies, and reinstated himself as god emperor. And last but not the least is Nero. I saved him for last simply because I dislike him the most, but let's get into it. Not that much is known about Nero's personal life, but what we do know is that he was pretty unhinged too. At the age of 16, Nero became emperor and things get crazy here. Nero orders people to kill his mother simply because she didn't like him with this girl. He falsely accuses his first wife Octavia for adultery, then have her killed. Then rumor has it that he also started the Great Fire in Rome and blamed it on the Christians. Actually, the latter part is still left unconfirmed, but what I'm trying to say is, Nero did some questionable stuff in his life, and he actually committed suicide after he was declared public enemy in Rome. Nero killed himself, but his supporters still worshipped and believed him, which is why he joined Commodus and Caligula to be god emperors. The Triumvirate's goal before the trials of Apollo is very vague, but what we do know is that they wanted to take over the world with someone. Their first client ended up being the Titan Lord Kronos and Luke Castellan's army of demigods and monsters. We don't really see any direct reference to the Triumvirate in the PJO books, but we get a pretty good hint of it in the Sea of Monsters. Here, Luke had Annabeth and Percy held captive in the Princess Andromeda, which, by the way, is a cruise ship that the Triumvirate funded for Kronos' return, and Luke mentions this line that hits a bit different once you learn about the Triumvirate. He said, "Join us and you'll be rewarded. We have powerful friends, sponsors rich enough to buy this cruise ship, and much more. Percy, your mother will never have to work again. You can buy her a mansion. You can have power, fame, whatever you want. Annabeth, you can realize your dream of being an architect. You can build a monument to last 1,000 years, a temple to the lords of the next age." The way Luke sounds so confident is pretty eerie and shows just how powerful the Triumvirate can actually be with that much resources and power. Aside from the Princess Andromeda, the Triumvirate also funded weapons, helicopters, and human mercenaries that we got to see in PJO, Heroes of Olympus, and the Trials of Apollo. They've always been there, behind the scenes, waiting for their clients to take over and for them to rule alongside them. However, when Kronos was defeated after Luke killed himself in The Last Olympian, things changed. The Triumvirate's plan for a takeover with Kronos failed, and they approached their next client, the Earth goddess Gaia. In the Heroes of Olympus, Gaia manipulates and tricks a lot of people to do her bidding, but the main victim of this was the Roman legacy of Apollo, Octavian. Octavian was convinced that Camp Haplet was Camp Jupiter's enemies, and he fell for Gaia's plan of making the two camps fight against each other. Because of this, the Triumvirate gave all sorts of weapons to Octavian in the hopes that Camp Haplet and Camp Jupiter would start a full-on war. Luckily, this didn't happen as Gaia was defeated after the demigod Leo Valdez sacrificed himself and the Triumvirate lost again. Moving forward with the second failure, the Triumvirate decided to take matters into their own hands, and this ended up being in the Trials of Apollo. As the Trials of Apollo's title suggests, these books centers on the god Apollo, who gets turned into a mortal teenager named Lester, and the Triumvirate decides to use this to their advantage. So at this point, let's go to the events of the Trials of Apollo to see how the Triumvirate organization survived to their ultimate downfall. But first, let's get some context. To quickly summarize what the Triumvirate wants now is that they want to control prophecies through the different oracles, and they already started a book before the Trials of Apollo series. In the Blood of Olympus, or the last book of the Heroes of Olympus series, Apollo's oracle, or the Oracle of Delphi, was controlled by the serpent Python. Python was a mortal enemy to Apollo, and now he was controlling Delphi's land and disrupting prophecies from happening. This was a serious issue, and it's also the reason why Zeus got so mad at Apollo for quote-unquote abandoning the islands of Python, thus bringing us to where Zeus punishes Apollo for it. So with this context, let's go to the Hidden Oracle, or the first book of the Trials of Apollo series. Here, Apollo's mortal story starts with him literally falling from the sky and landing in a dumpster. Apollo then meets these two thugs who beat him up and try to mug him, and these were actually Nero's servants. Later on in the book, Nero admits that he orchestrated the incident because he wanted to welcome Apollo to Nero's city. However, a demigod daughter of Demeter named Meg McCaffrey came in and defeated the thugs and helped Apollo escape. Meg is actually a very interesting part of the Trials of Apollo because she was technically a part of the Triumvirate through Nero. This was probably the biggest plot twist that we got in the Hidden Oracle, as Apollo and Meg became friends throughout the book, only to find out that Meg was working with Nero this entire time. Meg's relationship with Nero is very complicated, as seen in the 5 books, but it was always influenced by fear, so here's why. Meg was around 6 years old when Nero killed her father and blamed her for his death. Nero manipulated and controlled Meg's life from then on, and made her believe he was two people at the same time. Nero would either be kind to her, or he would have this persona of what she calls the Beast whenever he was horrible to her. This was detrimental to Meg's mental health, and knowing this control over her, Nero decides to use her to get to Apollo. In the Hidden Oracle, Nero wants one thing: to open the gates of the prophetic Grove Dodona and Camp Haplid. Nero wants to control this place with the Triumvirate's goal of controlling ancient oracles or prophecies, and he needs Apollo, the god of prophecies, to open the grove for him. This is why he sent those thugs that made Meg save Apollo. This was to make Apollo trust Meg and ultimately listen to her when she asked him to open the gate to the grove. Added to this, Nero decided to lure Apollo and Meg through kidnapping demigods in camp and keeping them inside the grove. Nero gives Apollo an ultimatum: open the gates or Nero will burn the kids to death. Apollo tells Nero that there's no way they were doing that, but Meg can't speak for herself because she's frozen with fear of Nero. I think the best line to describe Nero and Meg's relationship is what Meg says here. Apollo tries telling Meg that she can't follow Nero because Nero literally murdered her father, but Meg argues back, "The beast killed my father. This is Nero. He's my stepfather." This moment leads up to Meg begging Apollo to open the gates, but Apollo refuses, saying that they can't let the Triumvirate control the grove. This ultimately broke out into a fight, and Nero escapes after throwing Greek fire to the ground. It's chaos after that, as Nero also releases a statue known as the Colossus Neuronus to destroy Camp Haplid. Apollo manages to save the grove through the help of the Dryads, and he saves the captive demigods. However, the chaos is far from over. Apollo tries to find Meg after the fight earlier, but she tells him that they should not meet anymore because she just betrayed him and she feels horrible. Apollo tries to reason with her, but it's no use. He loses Meg, but he doesn't have time to think because of the Colossus Neuronus statue that attacked the campers from outside the grove. Apollo runs to the fight and ultimately manages to subdue the giant and save everyone. The book ends with Apollo meeting up with the former immortal titaness Calypso and the demigod son of Hephaestus, Leo Valdez. Apollo, Calypso, and Leo talk about how Nero mentioned that there were 3 members in the Triumvirate. Nero was obviously the first, and they decided to try finding the second emperor and stop them from finding the next oracle in Indianapolis. This brings us to the Dark Prophecy, or the second book. Here, Leo, Calypso, and Apollo arrive in Indianapolis, and they heard rumors that the next emperor was called the New Hercules. This actually referred to Commodus, who dubbed himself with this identity, and Apollo feels conflicted because of their shared history that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, this book focuses on Commodus, and his entire plan is that he wants to control the next oracle, or the Oracle of Trophonius, and the ones who make the Dark Prophecies. Anyway, we also get some more information on Meg through a dream Apollo has. Apollo realizes that Meg was sent on a mission to kill Apollo with some guards, but Meg escaped and is currently on the run. With Meg's disappearance and Apollo meddling with their plans, the Triumvirate decided to try finding both of them to kill them. To do this, they hired a Greek warrior named Laertes for the job. We actually met him in The Lost Hero, or the first book of the Heroes of Olympus series, and just to make you guys remember, it was when Jason, Piper, and Leo met King Midas, or Laertes' father, and got turned into gold. Anyway, Laertes tried to stop Meg and Apollo from finding the Oracle of Trophonius. Meg and Apollo eventually reunite when Apollo and Calypso saved some griffins to bring to a safe house known as the Way Station. The Way Station was where Apollo and the gang stayed in this book, and Commodus was threatening literal war on it just to get rid of Apollo and Meg. Going back to Meg and Apollo's meeting though, Meg saves them from some Germani guards and they escape. Apollo and Meg sort through their differences from the previous book, and they eventually became allies once more. In order to stop Commodus, Apollo and Meg enter his lair, and they're attacked in an arena the Triumvirate organized. Apollo and Meg defended each other, and eventually, the Hunters of Artemis along with Leo Valdez joins in the chaos. After that, Meg and Apollo decided to enter the cave of Trophonius before the Triumvirate gets to it. Apollo offers to receive the Dark Prophecy because it was very dangerous, but it leads up to Meg getting it instead. Meg is confronted with nightmare after nightmare, and Apollo saves her before the Triumvirate's forces tries to stop him. A creature called a Blemie tells Apollo to stop because they already boarded the cave with explosives to kill them both, but Apollo and Meg escape just in time. The craziness isn't even over yet though, because the way station was under attack by the Triumvirate and Apollo and the gang ran there. Commodus had people captive and tells Apollo to give up. After a back and forth conversation, Apollo actually manages to release this godly form for a little bit, and it's enough to blind Commodus and distract them. From there, everyone is surprised when Laertes betrays Commodus by throwing Commodus out the window, and the day was saved from there. Laertes converted from the dark side going to the good side from this moment, and the book ends with quite a cliffhanger. The group agreed that they needed to find the third emperor, and from the dark prophecy that Meg received earlier in the cave, they needed the help of the satyr Grover Underwood. And now, let's go to the Burning Maze. This book focuses on Caligula, and here's his plan. He wants to control the Oracle of Erythea or Hierophily. Hierophily was captured by the Triumvirate in their efforts to control fate and prophecies, and they kept her in a labyrinth, specifically in an area known as the Burning Maze. This maze was causing wildfires around California, and this because of Caligula's other goal of becoming the new sun god. Caligula is literally getting the Titan of the Sun Helios' essence in this maze, which is why it's burning like crazy, and he needs Apollo's essence too, because Apollo is the god of the sun. A new character we get introduced here is Incitatus, a talking horse of the Triumvirate whom Caligula loved so much for some reason. Anyway, the book's highlight is when Apollo, Meg, and the demigod daughter of Aphrodite, Piper McLean, try finding Hierophily to rescue her from the Triumvirate. Before heading to the quest, we actually see Piper and her dad clearing out their house, because apparently Caligula has been working for years to destroy her father's reputation. This led to Piper's family permanently leaving from their home to move to a new one in Oklahoma. Interestingly, we also learned that Meg's family was destroyed by the Triumvirate too. Like, the other reason the Triumvirate killed Meg's father was because Meg's dad was housing ancient dryads known as Melii. These Melii are extremely powerful beings, and the Triumvirate burned her house to the ground to stop them from reincarnating. Anyway, Piper, Meg, and Apollo try finding Hierophily, and it ended up horribly because the sorceress Medea attacked them. We actually met Medea before in The Lost Hero 2, but like Laertes, she's now working for the Triumvirate. A huge fight breaks out, and Medea unleashed Helios' fiery hot essence towards the trio. They managed to escape at the last second, but from that encounter with Medea, they learned that the demigod Jason Grace actually encountered Hierophily before, and that to get to her, they needed Jason. That night, Apollo gets a dream of Python and Nero talking. Python got mad at Nero because they lost both the Oracle of Trophonius and the Grove of Dodona in the previous books, but Nero argues back that they'll kill Apollo once and for all and get Meg back. Apollo soon wakes up, and it leads up to the most infamous moment of this book. Apollo, Meg, Piper, and Jason go aboard Caligula's ships. Here, Apollo and Piper try finding Caligula's shoes, because in the prophecy that they got in the previous book, it said that they needed the shoes to locate Caligula. They manage to find it, but Meg and Jason are captured by the Triumvirate. Piper and Apollo are then knocked out by Caligula's horse Incitatus. The group gathers in a room where Caligula gives Apollo one choice: give up his quote-unquote essence to make Caligula the sun god, or everyone's going to die. In a shocking twist of events, Apollo takes the arrow of Dodona and threatens to kill himself instead, because without Apollo, the ritual for Caligula to be the new sun god will not push through. Everyone is shocked, but they can't process anything else because Jason suddenly escaped from his prison and fought the Triumvirate's forces. Everything is in chaos at this point, and Caligula ran after Jason. Caligula and Jason had a brutal fight that led to Jason's death. Jason dies, and in his last moments, he made his horse Tempest bring Apollo, Meg, and Piper away from there. Piper and Apollo have a huge fight wherein Piper blamed Apollo for Jason's death, because if it weren't for Apollo's quest to find Caligula, Jason wouldn't have died. Later on though, Apollo and Meg decided to try finding Hierophily once more because they got intel on where she might be. They entered the burning maze to find Hierophily, who was chained to the ground. So the entire thing about Hierophily is that her oracle is kind of like a game of Scrabble, and you had to guess the words, but they didn't finish the prophecy because Medea came in. A fight breaks out as Apollo tries to complete the prophecy, and Meg tries to fight off monster after monster with Medea. Just then though, Piper came in and killed Medea. Behind her were the Melii that Meg's father tried to save all those years ago, and they fought out the Triumvirate's forces and won. The book ends with quite a cliffhanger as the Burning Maze is destroyed, and they learn that the prophecy that Apollo got from Hierophily is actually urging them to go to Camp Jupiter to meet the demigod Reina Ramirez-Arellano for the next step. So, long story short, the next oracle that the Triumvirate wants is in Camp Jupiter through the harpy Ella. Ella is a character that we meet in The Son of Neptune, and she memorized prophetic and lost Sibylline books. The Triumvirate wanted to get to her, and now let's go to the Tyrant's tomb. Here, Caligula and Commodus are plotting to attack Camp Jupiter in one huge battle. They already sent an ultimatum to Camp Jupiter to surrender or face death. They also recruited a corrupt king of Rome, Tarquin, along with a silent god named Harpocrates. In the Hidden Oracle, we learn that Camp Haplin and Camp Jupiter haven't been communicating as much, and this was because someone was messing with the signal and communication this entire time. This led to silence between the two camps, and this brings up Harpocrates, the god of silence. The Triumvirate had captured him to weaken the two camps, and Apollo along with Meg and Reina go to Sutro Tower to find Harpocrates inside. Apollo and Harpocrates have a pretty rocky history because Apollo apparently bullied him, but in the end, Meg and Reina managed to convince the silent god to help them out. Harpocrates finally agrees to save Camp Jupiter, and Apollo and the rest realize that what's keeping Harpocrates captive are two fasces. So I wasn't able to mention it earlier, but fasces are Roman symbols of power, and in the case of the Triumvirate, this literally represented their immortality. Without it, they would be mortal once more, and the ones bounding Harpocrates are for Commodus and Caligula. Realizing this, Meg and Reina attack the two fasces, and after a bit, they manage to destroy them. Meg, Reina, and Apollo soon realize that the prophecy from the previous book mentioned that they had to sacrifice a god to summon another god to help win the battle that was happening in Camp Jupiter. In the end, Harpocrates was the one who sacrificed himself for the greater good, and it's another heartbreaking scene. Like, we've been going through the entire trials of Apollo, and man, the emotions are so crazy here. This series is so underrated. Anyway, let's head to the battle at Camp Jupiter, and it's brutal. Commodus and Caligula soon walked in the battle themselves, and confronted the demigod and praetor of Camp Jupiter, Frank Jean, to surrender the camp and hand over Ella. Frank refuses, and instead challenges both of them to single combat to the death, and Apollo couldn't handle it. Apollo volunteers to help Frank, and Commodus attacks Apollo while Caligula ran after Frank. This led to a pretty intense fight on both sides as Frank lures Caligula into a cave filled with explosives. Caligula falls for it, and in the last moments of his life, Frank burned this lifeline firewood that triggered the bombs in the cave. Frank's last words were, "If I'm going to burn, I might as well burn bright. This is for Jason." A huge explosion rocks the camp, and Caligula is killed, and there's no sign if Frank survived. Apollo thinks Frank is dead and feels so much pain inside that he takes out his anger and grief on Commodus. And then, I'm not joking when I say that Apollo grabbed Commodus by the neck, choked him, and then literally screamed that disintegrated Commodus. Like, this scene was crazy, and the only one they needed to defeat next was Nero in the Tower of Nero. Anyway, even if Commodus and Caligula were both dead, the next enemy here in the Tyrant's tomb was Tarquin, or the Roman king from earlier. Frank's girlfriend Hazel soon realizes that Frank might be dead somewhere, and she decides to take her grief out by killing Tarquin. Hazel overpowers Tarquin, and Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt and Apollo's twin sister, was the one who finished them off. And now, let's finally go to the Tower of Nero. By this point, the only thing that the Triumvirate has in their control is the Oracle of Delphi, Apollo's signature one. Here, Apollo and Meg are attacked in a train going to New York by Nero's monsters. They manage to escape them, and this book introduces us to a new character named Lou, and she's actually a part of the Triumvirate as she works for Nero. However, Lou's on the good side because during her time under Nero, she actually befriended Meg. After a couple of events, Apollo and the gang start thinking of where Nero's fasces are. If they can get to it, they can finally weaken the Triumvirate once and for all. They realize that it's in Nero's tower, and in order to get there, Apollo and Meg have to surrender with Lou. They push through with the plan, but Nero sees through it, and we actually get another messed up part about Nero. Around the room where Apollo, Meg, and Lou are in are actually 11 kids around Meg's age who were emotionally manipulated by Nero. These kids are meant to resemble the 12 Olympians, and it's a really messed up moment. Anyway, Nero admits that he knows this is a fake surrender and makes one of the traumatized kids chop off Lu's hands. Lu is in extreme pain, and she and Apollo were taken by guards. Nero takes Meg with him to welcome her home, and Apollo is thrown into a cell with Lu. Later on, Apollo dreams and tries to take control of them by thinking of Nero's fasces. It's actually guarded by Mithras' creature. Yeah, I'm not gonna pronounce that. So anyway, I'll just say Nero's guard or Mithras' creature throughout the video. But going back, Nero's guard is actually very powerful, and the only way to bargain with it is to give up immortality. Apollo can't give that right now, but Lu actually can. So Lu is a part of the ancient race of Gaul, and she's technically immortal. Anyway, Lu and Apollo manage to escape their prison after tricking their guard, and the Triumvirate's forces attack them again. Lu tells Apollo to find Meg, while Lu will sacrifice her immortality to the Mithras creature guarding Nero's fasces. Apollo soon reunites with his demigod children, but he has one thing on his mind: Meg. Apollo runs to Meg's room upstairs and sees a laptop open with Nero on FaceTime. Nero gives Apollo another bargain: go to the throne room in 15 minutes, or else Nero will release a deadly gas that will kill Apollo and the rest of the campers downstairs who were fighting. Apollo has no choice, and he goes to Nero. Here, Nero presents Meg, and she looks different and soulless. Nero talks horribly of Apollo's past and manipulates everyone in the room to hate on Apollo. The dryads in the room got mad at Apollo after Nero's manipulation and attacks Apollo. Meg can't handle it and begs Nero to stop them. Nero and Meg then get into a heated argument where Nero tries to talk down on Meg, but in the end, it doesn't work. Meg stands up to Nero once and for all and defies him. Just then, an explosion shakes Nero's tower, and in comes Nico D'Angelo. A fight breaks out again, and Nero tries to release the deadly gas, but can't find the remote to do it. Apollo tries to shoot Nero with arrow after arrow, but it doesn't work. Nero found the right button and pressed it, meaning that the campers downstairs were dying. However, this was not the case because Will Solis, Rachel Dare, and Lu walked in with Nero's fasces. It turns out that the creatures called troglodytes messed with the gas chambers and it didn't release Nero's gas. Nero's plans were foiled, and he tried to bargain with all of them to spare him, but none of them were having it. Nero orders his remaining guards to fight them all, and Apollo tries to destroy the fasces. It leads up to them having a tug of war with the fasces, with Nero saying, "You cannot take it, Lester," and Apollo shoots back at him saying, "I am Apollo, god of the sun, and I revoke your divinity." This works, and the fasces split into two. Nero starts disintegrating, but before he dies, he tells Apollo that this was a mistake because Apollo let Python win. This because Python is the last leader of the Triumvirate, and by killing Nero, Apollo let Python take full control. Apollo understands, and Nero dies. Apollo's last quest of fully defeating the Triumvirate is to kill Python, his mortal enemy in both the books and in Greek mythology. Apollo finds Python in the caves of Delphi, and they have a huge fight. It was so intense that they literally fell through the cliff together and ended up in Tartarus or Hell. Apollo and Python continue fighting, and it ends with a pretty gruesome death for Python. Python was sucked into chaos, or the darkest abyss of the universe where everything started, and this being has full control of existence itself. Python was wiped out of existence, and Apollo was finally done. The Triumvirate was over, and it was all thanks to Apollo's trials. It not only helped Apollo grow as a person, but it also helped save the universe. Overall, that's the Triumvirate. It's an evil group of emperors who sought for power, and they've been behind the scenes, controlling everything for too long. By the Tower of Nero, they were defeated, but how sneaky and evil they all were will always be remembered, and they're by far one of the worst villains in the Riordanverse. So, how about you? What do you think of Triumvirate Holdings? Let me know in the comments down below.